For more on the ECOWAS 50th anniversary celebration, we're now joined by Ambassador Joe Keshi, a former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Chris Kwajai, professor of international relations, joins us shortly. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador, on Newsnight tonight. Well, first off, I mean, ECOWAS celebrating at 50 in a time of fragmentation. Like you heard, some of the top guests there say, look, we actually heard from Gowon say that we thought that military incursions were a thing of the past. But ECOWAS was set up, to encourage regional integration, economic integration, foster free movement, and all of that. What's your assessment of ECOWAS 50 years on? Do you think it has lived up to the promise?
Well, by the way, thanks for having me. To a reasonable extent, I think that ECOWAS has not done too badly. When you consider the challenges it has faced over the last 50 years, it spent 10 good years, 10 good years, or actually 12 good years, in trying to resolve the crisis in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And during that period, certainly the issue of economic integration or cooperation, just didn't come up because the focus on was trying to stabilize the region first of all. And I think, consequently, that's so out of the 40 years, 10 years, out of the 50 years, more than 10 years was on the Liberia and Sierra Leone. In fact, in Liberia and Sierra Leone for those 10 years, if I remember correctly, they held more than 20 meetings trying to resolve that crisis alone. Now, when you think of other conflict resolution, measures that they've been in, crises they've had to deal with, you'll agree that the little they have achieved, like the free movement of persons and, goods and services, which actually has worked for, particularly for Nigerians in this part of the world, and the trade liberalization. I think these are modest achievements that for the next 50 years that I believe that they can build upon.
And when you look back at 5 decades...
And by the way, with reference to what General Gowon said,
yes,
we should not forget that most of those who signed the original agreement were military men. I rest my case.
Okay, very well said. But what needs to be done differently? We had the chairman of ECOWAS, President Bola Tinubu, speaking there. He says that the community must now move from policy to real implementation, putting women, children, and innovation at the center of it all. But one wonders, if you look at the last decade or so, we've seen the spate of coups. Has ECOWAS done right in upholding democracy, and what's holding it back?
Look, not really. Quite often we talk about, with respect to the Nigerian situation, leadership crisis. In the ECOWAS sub-region as well, we have the same issue. But I think that going forward, for the next 20, 40, 50 years, by the way, they have a development agenda,
yes,
which I believe if they can implement, as President Tinubu pointed out, I think that they'll probably do better in the next 50 years because they already have the experience. They already understand the challenges that they feel, in fact, including the financial constraints that they have. But if the leaders are determined and they have the political will, quite often it's the political will. When you come together to form an organization like this, something has to give in. You have to lose a bit of your sovereignty. If the leaders are prepared to do that and to say that we are going to work together as a community, I think the next 50 years will be probably better than this last 50 years. But what they have to realize, or we all have to realize, is the fact that at the end of the day, when you look at a number of countries around the world, their largest, greatest trading partners are their neighbors.
Right.
And that's exactly what I believe we should be doing here. But unfortunately, we have challenges. We are not industrialized. We are not moving in the right direction democratically, as you pointed out. And all has to do with leadership. There is no doubt about that. But there is crisis of leadership across the region. One can only hope that going forward, they would have learned enough lessons and develop the political will to implement the agenda they have launched today for the next 30 years.
Quite interesting. Let's go back to the issue of integration and, of course, economic integration. Some say that ECOWAS may have, lost its bite somewhat. It's more or less a toothless bulldog, especially when you consider the breakaway nations of, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and, of course, Guinea. ECOWAS has not been able to convince these breakaways to come back, to the fold. Why do you think that is? Because you just talked about ECOWAS' success in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and what have you.
Look, we all agree a mistake was made, particularly with regards to Niger, our neighbor here. I think there's a consensus that a mistake was made by ECOWAS leaders. But this is what I would say. At the end of the day, if ECOWAS begins to function, if it begins to ensure integration, these same countries will come. On this your studio here, when the whole crisis was on, I did say, yes, we could expand energy in trying to get them back. If they refuse to come back now, we don't have to bother ourselves. Somewhere along the line, they would come back. If we begin to build what I call the regional infrastructure, for example. Today, my organization, the Retired Career Ambassadors of Nigeria, we issued a statement where we suggested that if we begin to focus on building the blocks of integration, regional, infrastructure, if we expand trading, if we build up the financial services, for sure, these countries will be compelled to come back on their own. They will definitely come back. That's not because it will also be very difficult for them to trade with the rest of ECOWAS. Right. ECOWAS is a larger body, and they certainly would like to come back. I think their problem today is that they have their own security issues, and they do not think that we are paying enough attention to it. We cannot pay enough attention to it because the only country who could have helped to pay attention to it is itself emerges in its own security problem, and that's Nigeria. So until we can resolve these contradictions, but I repeat what I've said many times, these countries, somewhere along the line, will come back to ECOWAS. I have no doubt about that in my mind.
Well, I wish we all, we all share your optimism when you see that this same AES have imposed taxes currently on goods from ECOWAS. So it does look like they're gone for good, but we'd like to keep it optimistic. Let me ask you about the global power shift. I mean, we're seeing Russia and China expanding influence on the continent. We're seeing the US, the West, US under Donald Trump. But the AES seems to be aligning with other world powers away from so much ECOWAS had done in the last 50 years. What does all of that say, and how can the bloc protect itself without becoming collateral damage in this power tussle, as ECOWAS, and all that geopolitics?
I'm not too sure. I have read a couple of concerns on, for example, the presence of the Russians. Look, excuse me, this is not the first time we've expressed this concern about the Russians being in West Africa or being in Africa, for example. But when you look at the history, at the end of the day, the Russians have really not made any significant inroad beyond the initial coming, creating that apprehension and things like that. Somewhere along the line, they have really not pushed. As you find, look, compare the Russians to the Chinese. I would say, I think it was the Russians that first discovered Africa, that first joined in African development. But they've been overtaken by the Chinese. I don't know how many Russian investment you find around the continent today as compared to the Chinese or the Asians, for example. What is happening, for example, in the Saharan region is the fact that they needed the help of a country or some powers to help them resolve their security issues.
Yes.
Beyond the security issues, can the Russians do anything more? I doubt it. I served in Ethiopia for a couple of years.
Yeah.
It was completely occupied by the Russians. But at the end of the day, they lost heart because beyond providing military hardware and military assistance, what the Russians did at the end of the day. If you go to, Ethiopia today, as compared to when I served in Ethiopia, it's a complete different transformation. The Russians did not contribute to that transformation. So at the end of the day, these southern states would also discover the hard truth and will probably come back, to where they began from.
So you think ECOWAS will be stronger than
ECOWAS will be stronger if the leaders develop that political will to drive the process. It's a question of driving the process.
Right.
And also, ECOWAS must also become ECOWAS of the people. Somewhere along the line, the region must begin to elect members of parliament to the ECOWAS, not nominated by the various houses.
Right, Ambassador Joe Keshi, former PAMSEC, Minister of Foreign Affairs, thank you very much for joining us on Newsnight.
Thank you.